Voluminous subject, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the public hearing. The Kansas statutes require that prior to any consideration of a revision or modification or a new comprehensive plan for Salina and the surrounding planning area, that the Planning Commission conduct an open public hearing. And so this is the first, and it will be your decision whether it is the only, because there may be things that you identify that you might want to get additional public input on. So just to summarize, the purpose of the meeting is to get questions answered, to receive comments, and we do have Graham Smith of Gould Evans here to answer any questions. But your options after hearing all the comments that you hear this evening would be to recommend that the plan document and supporting plan maps be adopted and submitted to the governing body as presented. You could recommend that the document and supporting plan maps be adopted with certain revisions or modifications being made. We kind of cited for you the example. You had several meetings discussing the conservation area proposed north of and outside the levee, and you decided to change some of the language there, as well as we identified some changes or fixes to that map. So that would be the kind of thing, if there was a correction or a revision that was minor in nature, you could tack that on to any action you took to recommend the plan, and we would make sure that those minor amendments were done as an addendum to the plan. You could recommend that certain portions be resubmitted for your review at a later date, or you could continue this hearing to a future meeting date if you want to allow for additional public comment or input as to certain aspects of the plan. But our goal in our staff report was not to recap everything, but the process started in January 2008, and as you can see from the public participation plan that was attached, there were focus groups and public informational meetings and an advisory committee, and there were numerous opportunities for public comment and input, including a week-long charrette that took place down at the Watson Room of the Stiefel Theater. And all that culminated in October 1st, 2009. There was a joint study session with the Planning Commission and City Commission, and Graham Smith of Gould Evans was there, and as well as city staff. And the plan was gone over into in some detail, and questions were asked and answered. And then what occurred from October 1st to the present is that we tried to break down certain aspects of the plan for you, which you could address on a meeting-by-meeting basis, and we completed that task. And just to summarize a couple things that were input items from you, you had recommended that development be discouraged and not outright prohibited in the conservation area, and that there be some certain exceptions or criteria that, if they were met, that would allow for some development to occur in those areas if it wasn't floodway. You looked at the implementation matrix, and based on what we heard for follow-up items, you thought that a master utility plan that looked at areas inside the city that needed improvements to support infill development, you thought was a top priority, as well as developing an off-street trails master plan for bicycle and pedestrian trails. And you also expressed a desire to participate in that. We did also want to emphasize that the North Ohio Gateway overlay, the South 9th Corridor overlay, Hospital Medical Land Use Plan, and East Salina Master Plan, which were specific additions to the plan, will be carried over in the new plan. And there is work going on right now with the Friends of the River and consultants to develop a plan for renewal of the old Smoky Hill River Channel, and that is also likely to be considered for adoption as part of this comprehensive plan, but that would occur later this year. So the purpose again is to get familiar with the plan once again and address any questions that commissioners have. I was going to introduce Graham Smith with Gould Evans, our planning consultant. He's going to give you an overview. Feel free to ask him any questions as subject comes up, and then we'd like to open it up for public comment and questions.
Thank you, Dean. Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, I'm Graham Smith with Gould Evans. We've been working with some of you all and staff and members of the community for the past approximately 2 years to get to the point where we are tonight. And really the intent of the meeting tonight, as Dean has gone through, is to consider the plan in its entirety for adoption. And we'll talk about some next steps when we get to the end of the presentation. I believe most of you have seen this presentation maybe more than once. This is a little bit modified from the study session that we did, and then as Dean said, you guys have seen pieces of this in some detail over the past couple of months. Please feel free to stop me whenever you want. Yell hey you, whatever, and we can just field questions from you as we go along. Oops. I already got the technology wrong. So part of the first part of the planning process was to identify a vision statement. What does Salina want to be in 20 years, 25 years? And then really the bulk of the plan is how do we get there? So working with the community, working with the steering committee and different groups of folks, we identified a vision statement. You've seen this all before. It hasn't changed dramatically. It hasn't changed at all since the study session, but you'll see in here terms like a regional center, good jobs, quality housing, goods and services, quality health care, education, cultural and recreational opportunities. But really what everything in this vision statement gets down to is trying to promote a higher quality of life for all the residents, all the businesses, those people that use Salina on a daily basis and live here. And so keeping that in mind, the vision statement is really laid out, the plan is really laid out to try and do that for everyone in Salina. We also came up with a series of value statements. Again, throughout these value statements, you'll see a lot of the same terminology that's in the vision statement, talking about economic issues, talking about education, arts and culture, talking about our youth as the future of the community, and all these things. And really these value statements are intended to help guide people as they implement the plan and try to achieve the vision for the future. One of the first things that we produced coming out of the Charrette Week, which I know many of you participated in, was this idea of a future concept map. If you remember the Charrette process, what we did was we brought to town a series of alternatives of things, of ways the community could develop and things that we could implement to achieve that vision that was defined. And this was what the week really culminated in, was this one concept being carried forward. And some of the things that you'll see carried forward into the plan is this idea of large employment hubs, the idea of commercial centers surrounded by neighborhoods, the park system that supports all the population in the neighborhoods, and then this idea of this conservation zone that we'll talk about more later. So to dive into the plan, one of the first components, and probably the primary component of any comprehensive plan, is the future land use plan. Whether you're planning commission, an elected official, a developer, a property owner, most people, when they think of a comprehensive plan, are most familiar with the land use map. It tells them generally what their property is slated for in the future, what its uses may be in the future. And coming out of that concept map that we showed you, that was one of the first things we undertook. We took the existing land use patterns, looked at the concept map, how some of those things might change based on the concept that was moved forward, and came up with a future land use map. And we also had several goals for the future land use that we included in the plan. And you'll see ideas in here of accessibility between different uses, development of mixed-use centers. Those were those commercial centers supported by residential, and in many cases including residential. The employment hubs, creating new neighborhoods, not necessarily creating new subdivisions, but creating new neighborhoods that are connected to other things. implementing conservation and agricultural land use designations to protect some of the natural resources and natural areas that we have. And then one of the big things that we was almost on a parallel track with the planning process was this idea of an interlocal agreement with the county to protect some of the fringes of the current community for future development. This is the land use map. I think you guys have gone through it in some detail at your study sessions, but you'll see that, as I said earlier, the concepts that we moved forward were really carried forward into this map with the large employment hubs around the airport and South 9th Street, and also in the north along the railroad and Old 40 Highway. And then this is a little hard to read, but the expansion of residential and infill residential in the existing community and supported again by those other uses. And really one of the major changes from your existing land use map is the, can't use the technology, is the idea of creating some of these hubs like commercial mixed-use hubs like downtown. We've identified some other mixed-use centers as far as these destination areas that we'll touch on in detail in a minute. One of the big ideas, I think, or one of the big changes that's in this plan from your existing plan is this idea of mixing uses. And when we talk about mixing uses in planning terms, it's on two different levels. One, there's the vertical integrated or vertical mixed use where you're actually providing housing or office over retail or over office space. So you start to mix those things vertically that people can live above where they work or live in an apartment above a retail shop, live within that retail development so that their services are close at hand. And the other idea is the horizontal mixed use. So not necessarily taking your standard zoning practice where you have residential here and commercial here and industrial over here, but starting to look at some of those uses that might be more compatible and mixing those on a single piece of property. One of the things that is detailed in the plan is the Broadway corridor, and we'll get into more detail on that in a minute, but also the idea that at the airport, as you start to develop this employment hub, you'll notice that there's not really an industrial land use, it's an employment land use. That idea is that you can start mixing some of those things that may be industrial production, but you may also have a retail shop on the corner, a gas station, those types of things. Start to mix some of those things in proximity so that they're accessible and they're used more readily. So as we went through the plan and we started identifying some of these mixed-use centers, we started looking at how they were going to serve the different populations within Salina, the different areas. So we came up with basically three scales. We talk about two of them in detail, and then the third one is really downtown, and I'll start with the first two, but we really talk about these at a neighborhood scale and a community scale. The neighborhood scale, as you can imagine, serves a smaller population, the surrounding one or two neighborhoods. It's daily services like dry cleaning and maybe banking. It could be a hair salon, it could be a convenience store. But the idea is that these things are mixed within an area that is easily accessible. You may have residential included in that as well, but it's much more accessible by foot and not necessarily, doesn't necessarily demand the use of an automobile to access these services. So we've prescribed different areas for community scale and neighborhood scale. The community scale, as you might imagine, is a little larger. It serves 4, 5, maybe 6 neighborhoods and has some of those bigger retail services that might be combined with residential and stuff like banking, small offices, maybe a small specialty grocery store, something like that, to serve a portion of the population in Salina. So in the land use plan, we defined these land use categories: the community center and the neighborhood center. And what we did is we created basically a table for each one of these different land uses, and it has a description of what the land use is. So as you can see here, the community center, which is a little larger, is typically 70,000 to 120,000 square feet of commercial development, retail service, or complementary office. And that really kind of sets the base of that mixed-use center. And then you start to add things on top of it like residential or additional out parcels, those types of things that are considered part of this center that provide those services. And really it serves that population of a 3 to 5 mile area, but it needs the support of a significant number of households to actually achieve that service. So we also added on here some primary uses, again, retail, service, office, public uses, whether that's a police function, a fire function, a government function, an institutional function such as a church, medical function. Those types of things can also be included in these larger community centers. And then we started looking at, well, where should these things go? So we added location criteria, and so for these larger areas we identified arterial intersections. If you have a highway and an arterial where they come together, that's a natural place because of the traffic flow that you're going to have traversing through that area. One of the ideas with all the centers is what we did was we started to look at some of those centers that were already primarily, well, they're single-use retail centers right now, but looking at those ones that were somewhat strong or had some position in the market that could be strong in the future, and started to build off of those. So as you start to redevelop those areas, change them to mixed-use centers where you're adding more components of institutional or residential or those types of support services to the retail and the office. We also added development criteria. So what should these things do? How should they respect their neighbors? Those types of things. So you'll see in here, you need an identifiable center to the center, if that's possible. And identifiable edge. So you need to know where these things stop. They don't just continue to bleed into the neighborhoods. They need to have a defined edge, but they need to relate to the neighborhood so that they're usable. Additional amenities such as public focal points, like open space, plazas, those types of things that encourage use. Streetscape. Really, these things, these additional development criteria are all about providing a quality environment which people want to use and people want to congregate and be in. We also went through and identified some secondary uses, again supporting some of these larger community centers with residential. And when we talk about residential in these terms, it's not single-family residential on single lots. It's townhomes, it's apartments, it's stacked flats, it's more dense residential that will provide a population that can help support some of those retail and office uses. And then also the civic and institutional uses, again, police, fire presence, church presence, institutional presence, those types of things help activate that and make it more of a 24/7 kind of a center. And then with the secondary uses, we had location criteria and development criteria as well. And the intent is that these secondary uses only add to the mix of what a community center should be. And so some of these things you might find on the perimeter of the center and not right in the heart of it. The neighborhood center, which is the smaller mixed-use center, very similarly laid out to the community center, just on a smaller scale. 30 to 70,000 square feet of retail or office supported with public and semi-public uses, again, those institutional or civic uses. These are a little bit closer together because they serve a smaller population, and they typically occur on a 5 to 15 acre tract. A lot of these centers, instead of picking an intersection and developing all 4 corners, sometimes you can get away with 1 or 2 corners so that they are connected. They're usable, they're walkable, they're friendly for people to use. Development criteria, again, talking about the scale, should be compatible with the neighborhood, should have that defined edge so that they don't continue to bleed into the neighborhood, but they're an asset to the neighborhood. Quality of development of the design of materials, looking at them as a whole and not, if you're not going to implement the center in one felled swoop, looking at it as a complete package so that as pieces come in, it's a comprehensive look at that and may have a comprehensive design scheme to it. And then looking at those transitions of how they relate to neighborhoods and surrounding uses. And then also with the neighborhood, we had secondary uses identified, again, residential, things that can support those primary uses within the neighborhood center. Please slow me down if I'm going too fast. I know you've seen this before, so I'm not trying to dwell on any one thing. And really the third type of center that we identified, it's really a regional center. We didn't call it regional center because you really have one of them and it's downtown, so we called it downtown. But really it is that it's the same concept as a neighborhood center and a community center, just on a broader scale. The downtown already acts as a regional center. It draws from outside the city of Salina. People come to downtown to shop and to bank and to do business. And so what we said in the plan was, let's try and continue that, and let's try and make it stronger. Let's add to the population downtown so that it is more accessible by foot and by bike and by your new transit system and all of those things, and not necessarily only dedicated to the car. You have other areas in town that we'll talk about that are more along those lines, but really downtown should be that walkable urban mixed-use center that it is today, but only stronger in the future. So we did a table much like the other categories for downtown. Again, kind of a regional center, higher density housing to support some of the services that are going on already, and we'll continue to grow those. Civic and institutional uses, you've got the government campus here, you've got other institutions downtown, and continue to connect those things within downtown to make it stronger and more vibrant. Secondary uses, again, increasing the residential density downtown, the residential numbers downtown would help start to do that. In the current market, that's probably not going to happen anytime quickly, but that's one thing that can help grow new business and support new business or existing businesses and make them successful. One of the development criteria things that we said for downtown was try and activate the street as much as possible. So where you have street frontage, retail uses that are used by patrons, people walking, people parking on the street and walking in, try and use those storefronts as much as possible to activate the street. You don't want long expanses of residential uses on the first floor because a lot of times people will pull their curtains and it's not very friendly and not very active. So especially along Santa Fe, and those connecting streets east and west, especially the immediate blocks off, you want to try and activate those streets as much as possible so it's busy and people are encouraged to walk and it feels safe. This is the downtown map and the downtown neighborhoods map. Again, just talking in a little more detail about the center that it is and really trying to improve the downtown as much as we can, encourage development and redevelopment in the area. You'll notice one of the things we identified was this area along the river here, and it ties into some of the things that the Friends of the River are doing, but really starting to use the river as it's redeveloped and as it's cleaned up and made usable, really start to look at this area as a development opportunity that can use that river as an asset. One of the things I think during the process was convention hotel. That idea was thrown about. So starting to put some active uses in that area, that's just an example. It doesn't mean it has to go there, but start to activate that area and relate it back to the river and use the river as a development amenity for that area. You've got the two big anchors downtown, the government center on the north and the hospital campus on the south, that provide real stable anchors on the north and south to work with in between. And then in the plan, we also talked a lot about the neighborhoods around downtown. Downtown, just like any other center, shouldn't start bleeding out into the neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods are some of the oldest and historic neighborhoods that you have, and we want to maintain those and help those flourish as well. So we don't want to start encroaching with retail and commercial and office uses in those areas. We want to help protect those neighborhoods. So we part of the implementation matrix that we put together was focused on downtown, and again, it's all about making downtown better, protecting the surrounding neighborhoods, the historic districts, and actually implementing some of the things that you've identified in the past through the PUMA plan, the lighting plan. Use Salina Downtown Inc. as your kind of overseer or your go-to people for helping revitalize and improve downtown. And then we talked about gateways for downtown as well as the community as a whole. And one of the things that we've talked about, and we'll touch on it on the Broadway corridor, similarly with downtown, is the use of incentives to two areas that we think incentives are appropriate to use to encourage development. I think on a case-by-case basis, you'll decide what amount of incentives. But really, the policy that we talked about in here is that there are a few places that incentives would be appropriate, and this would be one of them. Continuing with the land use, we had some of the typical land use categories you see. We added in this one we had an urban residential, which is a more dense residential, and if you remember the map, which is way over there, really the urban residential are those neighborhoods around downtown. It's a higher density, single family. In some cases, you'll have duplexes, townhomes, and multifamily, but a lot of the urban residential are those existing neighborhoods around downtown. And then as you move out to the fringes, some of those areas where it may be necessary or right to promote a higher density of residential development, this category would also be appropriate. So we're saying duplexes, townhomes, apartments are secondary uses. 8 to 20 units per acre sounds like a lot. Again, on a case-by-case basis, you'd have to see what that looks like and what that means for a particular piece of property. And we also, similarly to the mixed-use centers, we went through the location criteria, development criteria for secondary uses and primary uses. And so I don't want to read all these to you. You've seen all these and I think have a pretty good grasp. If you don't, please ask. Suburban residential, pretty typical residential, what you're seeing on the outskirts of the city. Most of what's being developed now on the fringes is what we would classify under the suburban residential category. Typically single family, quarter acre lots, we went up to 10 units per acre if you can do it appropriately. Primary, I think that should say secondary uses are duplexes, townhomes, and apartments. Again, this would be a little bit different than the urban residential. You'd look at duplexes, townhomes, and apartments more in a garden-style apartment format and not necessarily a row house or a townhouse. So you would require more land, but you would have more units, so it wouldn't be as dense as an urban residential. Rural residential, we have one little spot north of the commercial activity north of I-70 that we identified as rural residential. That is basically estate lots. It's large lot. It's 20 plus acres per unit. Farmettes, ranchettes, whatever you want to call them. And we really didn't see an opportunity, and we'll talk a little bit more about the urban service area. We really didn't see an opportunity surrounding Salina to promote this type of development. Because you are somewhat hemmed in on two sides, we felt like the opportunity for growth to the east and to the south was more appropriate in a suburban and sometimes and more appropriate in urban style of residential. So we kept the rural residential to the existing areas, again, north of the commercial, north of I-70. It's a big user of resources. And one of the things that we said with rural residential is there's no expectation of municipal infrastructure. So as you develop in this pattern, you may have well water, you may have septic systems, and you may have gravel roads. So if somebody chooses to develop in this manner, they should expect that may be the city's response to their infrastructure. And again, we didn't feel like promoting this pattern on the east side and the south side of the community was beneficial and would really start to restrict the growth of the community on those two sides. Oh, I guess I should mention, secondary use, we had put in here a piece on cluster development. And for those of you that don't know what cluster development is, you probably all talked about it, but where you take your overall density and put it on just a piece of the overall property. So we may do 1 unit per acre, but we may do 10 units, but we may have 100 acres of land that we're going to reserve the rest for open space. So it's just a way of congregating those units together. And in those cases, you may be able to supply urban level of infrastructure to that. Again, it's somewhat on a case-by-case basis. The Conservation District, which is the area to the north along the river and what now is currently mapped as floodplain and floodway. And a lot of the discussions during the process were not only the conservation of this area from development to protect the river and the natural areas, but also to protect the existing community from additional flooding. So not only the impacts to the immediate conservation area, but the broader impacts that could come about from developing those within those areas. So what we had originally said was a minimum lot size of 60 acres per unit, and really the only development that we would want to see on that 60 acres is residential. We wouldn't be promoting retail or industrial or anything like that within this area. And really what we had listed as the primary uses were those more passive uses of agriculture, open space, natural space and recreation, and then trails. We did add the cluster development into this, again on a case-by-case basis, looking to see if that's appropriate within this conservation district. The commercial category, this would be more along the lines of your typical commercial development. This category would be most prevalent down along South 9th Street, where you have a more suburban style of commercial development. It is very heavily geared towards the automobile. I think one of the nice things about Salina that I noticed right off the bat is you do have different areas to accommodate different styles of development. You have South 9th, which is obviously the pattern is suburban retail, and that provides a service to the entire community and the region for that matter. And then you also have downtown that is a very urban area that you can provide a different style of service to the residents and to the region in that case as well. So this is another type of commercial, again, South 9th, that provides those services. Primary uses: retail, service, office, some civic opportunities, including recreation, trails, those types of things. Location criteria, again, primarily South 9th, so location is adjacent to arterials, major thoroughfares, highway, those types of areas. Development criteria, one of the things that we said was if you're going to do this in a significant way, you need to combine your access points, share ingress and egress, and then provide cross-access easements. So as you develop in this pattern, it doesn't hinder the through mobility of the arterial street network. And so we think this pattern can continue and make the arterial street network stronger and work better for that type of development. And then Dean mentioned the overlay districts, and one of the things that we had in here was extending the South 9th Street overlay district to include further south as you continue to develop that area. I'm stuck. Employment, again, as I said earlier, we didn't carve out a specific industrial land use category. We thought it was more appropriate to combine some of these different uses. This is employment, as you probably figured out after going through this. This is heavily geared towards industrial, warehousing, office parks, some of those bigger land users that are required. You have an amazing start on this pattern already out at the airport and the surrounding areas and all the things that are going on out there. But it's the industrial uses, the warehousing, office, heavy industrial. We did put some development criteria on things, including, again, the cross-access easements to relieve some of the burden on the arterial streets and some of the local streets within those developments. The other employment area that you have going is what we called North Downtown. Along the tracks, on the big map we had that purple swath just below the conservation area and residential area. That area, again, you have two different areas that can provide two different styles of employment development. You have an existing old building stock that's great for reuse as office or tech space. It's got somewhat big floor plates, so you can do different things in that north of downtown. You've got land, and you've got access, and you've got infrastructure to the south, so those big manufacturing, warehousing things. So you have both sides of the equation that you can attract those and continue to grow those employment uses. We did also talk about a urban industrial overlay district on the north part. And really what that is more of a design overlay to help protect some of the existing structures that are reusable in that area, some of the old urban industrial pieces that are down there that can be saved and reused, but also promoting a development pattern within that area that either mimics or respects that urban form of that old urban form of industrial. So building to the street, parking on the side or in the rear, those things. Again, those are going to be smaller specialty types of industrial and office uses, not the large warehousing uses. And this is what I was talking about a minute ago. We have kind of the suburban style and the urban style. We had these different economic development hubs is what we called them, and this is really a combination of the employment areas and the commercial areas. Obviously the airport industrial areas, that suburban style. The South 9th Street, or excuse me, the South 9th Street, but also north the 9th Street I-70 areas, that suburban style, and then north downtown on the east, which is really that area around Ohio Street, north of downtown, in that area along Pacific. I always mess this up. Pacific going out to Ohio is really more of that suburban style of development. That area would be appropriate for warehousing, but as you start to move back to the west, around 9th Street and those areas, it's really more of an urban style of pattern that we want to promote. Obviously downtown's urban style, and then within these mixed use areas also promoting an urban style of development. So I think we had a lot of land use implementation items. I think they're, just the one slide. I thought we had two. But a lot of these are geared towards implementing that new idea of the mixed use centers, the employment centers, really starting to make it more achievable in doing these connected centers of connected activity centers, whether it's employment, whether it's mixed use retail and residential, but starting to connect some of these things together, including some of the civic uses and recreational uses and all those things. The other part of one of the first chapters was we called growth and development, and really this focuses on as the community continues to grow, what manner do we grow in? And really what we heard throughout the process from steering committee, from the public was not only should we grow at the fringes, but infill should be a big part of what we do in the future. One of the things we'll talk about in a minute is the Broadway corridor, which in many ways and in many areas of it, as you move towards the north of that corridor, it's ripe for redevelopment now. And so how do we promote infill, whether it's through a mixed-use center, through residential, or through civic and through recreational uses? And so really what the plan says is that there should be a balance of both, of new growth and infill. And we'll talk about both. We'll talk about infill specifically in a minute with areas like the Broadway corridor, but don't focus solely on new growth at the fringes and extending infrastructure and doing all those things necessary to get new development. What we're really talking about is look at your existing infrastructure, look at your existing investments, and how you reuse those investments to promote infill development or redevelopment of property, whether it's housing or retail and office. And one of the things that we looked at and we worked with the staff on is this sewer system master plan to provide services to the growth areas. If you can see the purple outline here is the urban service area, which we'll talk about a little more. But really this was looking at how do we continue to provide services into those areas that we're going to grow. And so this is the sewer map and this is the water system map. So working with utilities and coming up with some of these preliminary ideas of how we serve these areas for future growth. As I said several times, the Broadway corridor was an emphasis for us, and particularly in the infill, between the infill idea and the mixed-use center idea. one of the things that we noticed a lot driving up and down the Broadway corridor is it's got quite a few what we call missing teeth. There's some good development, and there's some vacant development. There's some vacant parcels, and really starting to look at that area as a repositioned mixed-use center, particularly in the area of Crawford and Broadway, to congregate some of those uses and provide a density of service and use to the surrounding neighborhoods, and starting to backfill some of those areas that we're not going to redevelop with retail with higher density residential. Again, trying to create some of the market there, or additional market to support some of those new retail and service uses. And this is one of the areas that we also said was most appropriate for the use of incentives or the use of tools to encourage development. We identified the creation of a TDD to address the street network or transportation development district, where development pays into a fund to help improve the entire street network as far as accessibility and connectivity for that district. Within the last year, the state of Kansas has passed CID legislation, which is really a self-taxing jurisdiction where developments or areas of the community can self-tax themselves and provide improvements, provide safety, provide marketing, provide upgrades to properties within that district, within the district in which people are paying into that. And then the use of TIF in the right circumstances, the use of TIF or other incentives to encourage development and make development feasible. I think everybody understands that infill and redevelopment's a little bit different animal than greenfield development, and in many ways it can be more difficult. And so removing some of the pediments and helping those types of projects, whether it's procedural or administrative approvals, those types of things can also help make those projects successful. So this was the land use map, a little bit more detailed land use map that we came up with and is in the plan. And as you'll see, the community center around Crawford and Broadway, and starting to look at some of these areas that are some vacant properties, some underutilized properties, starting to backfill those in with neighborhood types of higher density residential. The important thing about the redevelopment of this area in particular is that it needs to respond to what's already around it. When I say that, I mean the neighborhoods. It needs to respect the scale, the development types, those types of things that are already occurring in those areas that want to be saved, that need to be promoted and can contribute to the overall redevelopment of the corridor. So it's not a slash and burn mentality necessarily. It's really respecting the context within which you're operating and redeveloping the corridor appropriately. And then at the north end, really looking at as the city continues to grow and urban industrial opportunities continue to grow, really this is an area that's got that pattern established a little bit, and so let's just keep going with it in this area up here. And that starts to congregate some of the uses that are spread out along this corridor up into this area, and then the retail in this area. And then we also did the same on the south end, where you've got a significant amount of commercial here, and it starts to stretch up the corridor on 9th Street and down the corridor, and start looking at, again, creating a density of retail and service in a defined area and supporting that with additional population around it. One of the things I should say about the neighborhood center concept is the whole center idea and the distance apart that they are is really based on a market demand approach. There's an organization called the International Council of Shopping Centers, and they do a lot of retail analysis, office analysis, those types of things about how far different size centers should be located apart to serve the population and not be in direct competition with one another. The whole goal of this is to provide these centers so that they're successful, so that they're competitive in the marketplace, but they're not competing within their own specific market with other things, so that they're cannibalizing one another and you don't have any strong centers. So the idea is that you put these different scales of centers far enough apart that they can compete effectively within their market area. And so we can talk about that more if you like. The urban service area really is the growth area for the future. Again, one of the things we did is identify those areas for growth. As I said earlier, we didn't feel that there was a real big need for the rural residential on the land use plan because we didn't want to start cutting off growth areas. And so through the urban service area, working with the county and trying to identify some transitional development standards or interim development standards that allows property owners in the area to do some things with their property but won't ultimately hinder urban growth in those areas, because as development returns and the community continues to grow, those are the areas that we want to grow into, and we need it to be we need to be able to grow into those areas efficiently and effectively with extension of infrastructure, extension of services and roads and those types of things. So the urban service area, this is the map that's in the plan. The highlighted yellow areas are those areas that by the city staff were kind of designated as future annexation areas that they've been looking at. But the colored areas outside here are the urban service area, and the colors of the urban service area really respond to the land uses. So as you can imagine, around the airport, continuing the industrial or the employment pattern with industrial and office in this area to, again, promote that employment center within that growth area. It's a little hard to read, but this is the residential growth area with some mixed-use centers in there as they are warranted to serve that population. The conservation areas within this growth area up here. And then one thing we identified on here at the corner of in the vicinity of I-70 and I-135 is this economic development opportunity. And it's a little hard to define at this point, but what we've been calling it is that kind of once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that presents itself for economic development within Kansas City. Wyandotte County has the Raceway. Minneapolis has the Mall of America, which for this instance is a bad example, because what we've always said is if it's a mall that wants to go locate out there, it's probably not a good investment. You've already got one mall, and I'm not sure that investing that much money into another mall would be a good investment out here. Something that brings a significant amount of return, and we've put some criteria in here, but a significant amount of return for the investment that's going to be needed to service this area is what we're really looking for through high quality jobs, through tax benefit to the community, and those types of things is what we're talking about. So one of those big, again, once in a lifetime economic development opportunities. These are the growth and development ideas from the implementation matrix. So again, focusing not only on new growth, but on infill and redevelopment and creating quality neighborhoods through code enforcement, through overlay districts that promote either an urban development pattern or quality suburban development pattern, redevelopment of North Broadway with urban residential, further North Broadway with industrial, creation of these community level retail centers, and those different ideas. This is the one we had two pages of things. So, but they're all again geared towards that idea of providing an increased quality of life and providing an accessibility of services, housing, and all those things to the community. The next thing was connectivity. We talked about a lot of different things in the connectivity chapter. I think, but the overarching idea is that through the land use pattern and through the street networks and the other through the multimodal transportation networks, so not only streets but trails and transit and bicycle, pedestrian ways, all of those things, how do we better connect the community and make it more accessible for people to use the different pieces of the community, whether it's different neighborhoods, community services, public services, retail, jobs, all of those things. So we do talk about the roadway network. We talk about it in being an idea of complete streets, which really is how do we start to look at roads more than just for the automobile, but also incorporate some of those pedestrian aspects, bicycle aspects, and promote good development around them. The transit system, you guys have already started implementing the City Go system. So how do we continue to build on that, and how do we promote that and its accessibility into the community? Bicycle and pedestrian is a big one. We've got a bicycle map, just kind of a concept map for a bicycle plan in there. The rail system was one thing that we talked about a little bit in this section, and it was at one time a big topic of conversation, and I don't know if everybody's forgotten about it, so I may not bring it up, but I'll bring it up. Was the idea of relocating the rails from the center of the city out to the airport and the industrial area. Again, that's one of those long-term, if the city wins the lottery type of things. It could create a huge impact for the interior of the city, removing the trains and the tracks that go through the community, and still provide the service that's needed on the exterior of the community to those industrial uses and those types of things. But that is truly a long-range, big-ticket item that the plan will not live or die by. But it's something to keep in the back of your mind. If that's something that should be done, then that's in there. The municipal airport, again, it's already established as a regional employment center, so how do we continue to grow those things and make better use of the asset that sits there now from the runways and the airport facilities. And then this is where we talk more about the bicycle network. In addition to the parks network, we had a linear park system which plays into the bicycle network. It's kind of a trail system, an on-street system, off-street system, sharing lanes, and again, this idea of complete streets. So how do we work in some of those other facilities into the street network? We talked a little bit about pedestrian networks, really identifying those areas where pedestrians are going to be prevalent and make them the most important thing. One of the big things was connecting neighborhoods to schools, allowing people to walk safely to and from school within downtown, throughout the commercial mixed-use centers, connecting parks to the population, and those types of ideas. This is the bicycle concept plan, again, an idea of trying to connect some of the parks and the linear park system with an on-road system to start to connect the community in a different way. So the connectivity ideas, again, the complete streets idea. One of the other things that we had was the idea of impact streets. We have an arterial street, or a major street plan that identifies arterial streets, collector streets, neighborhood streets like a typical street plan would do. And the thing that we tried to overlay on top of it, or what we did overlay on top of it, was this idea of impact streets, where the impact streets are those primary streets that not only the residents use almost on a daily basis, but visitors to the community really use those as they move through town. And so what we said was those are the areas where you should put an additional investment in to create a higher quality of street, so that impact, that first impression, that lasting impression on people that are using the community and may not live or work here, have a positive experience. So it's a higher design standard, increasing the crosswalks, increasing streetscape, creating some boulevards out of different pieces of the street network, and those things that really leave a lasting impression. And then the other thing tied into the streets was the idea of community gateways. It's on the map back here, but looking at not only the highway interchange exits as community gateways, which they definitely are, and holding those to a higher standard of development. Again, kind of that first impression of Salina for people that are visiting or coming to work in the community. What is their first impression of the community? And those areas, as they exit the interstate, those areas should be held to a higher design standard, create a welcoming gateway for those areas. But also the idea of gateways to neighborhoods around downtown, In downtown, it's really about delineating where downtown is and that you've entered into downtown and it's a different area of the city than what you've been in. And it's also a way to identify the downtown from the surrounding neighborhoods so that people have a clear understanding of those two elements. This is the major street plan, as I spoke of a minute ago, and this again lays out the arterial street network, the collector street network. And the one idea that again, is one of those that's still in here and is kind of a big ticket item, but we felt could do downtown some good, was the idea that at the north end of 9th Street, just north of the tracks, and at the south end of 9th Street around Cloud Street, is that you connect 9th Street to Santa Fe in a more direct way. It does a couple of things. One, it moves your primary through traffic off of 9th Street through this neighborhood area onto Santa Fe and gets more cars in downtown in front of the businesses down there. And then it also allows you to turn this stretch of 9th Street back into really a more residential kind of street feel for those houses that are along there now. Again, big ticket item, probably involves some property acquisition, involves a significant amount of engineering and paving. So again, another one of those big ticket items that doesn't mean the success or failure of the plan in its entirety. This is the impact street and community gateways. Again, the green streets are the impact streets, and again, it's the major roadways: Ohio, Crawford, Magnolia, Schilling, Broadway, 9th, Santa Fe, and those types of streets. And then the gateways are the yellow areas, again, off the interstates, and then future access points as the community grows. So the connectivity implementation, again, focused on kind of that multimodal aspect, not only the automobile and the arterial or the street network, but pedestrian. Don't forget about pedestrians and bicyclists, the transit system, and again, the connectivity of the overall community to use different pieces of the community, whether it's retail or neighborhoods, the park system, those types of things is what the implementation is all about. Some more implementation. Another chapter was parks, and this was the idea of taking the existing park system, expanding it, creating a balanced system of public parks, not only small neighborhood parks, but larger community-wide parks, which you have both of now. And then incorporating what I talked about earlier as the linear park system to really provide an additional level of connectivity throughout the community, but also to connect the park system. So that people can move between parks and the different recreational activities within the different parks. And then providing additional parkland as development occurs. So as the community continues to grow, a portion of the city's already divided into the park districts. So as development occurs, having development pay its fair share for those parks that you'll want as future growth occurs. So that they can happen in a coordinated manner. So the parks implementation, again, the balanced system, providing new parks, dedicating public connections between neighborhoods and parks. Those ideas, again, making the parks an integrated part of your overall community. The community chapter really focused more on people and neighborhoods and some of the public services. We talk about things like a diverse quality housing stock, again, getting back to new housing stock, rehabilitated housing stock, infill housing, not only single family, but apartments, townhomes, a whole housing stock that can provide housing opportunities for all ages, all incomes throughout the community. One of the bigger ideas in here was implementing a neighborhood self-assessment process. And really what the assessment process is intended to do is to allow neighborhoods as they define themselves, and I think the city's already started defining some of those based on the census information, is allow the people that live in those neighborhoods to, in some ways, take hold of the reins and define what they want to be in the future. And then also to start to define some of those strategies and things that they can do in conjunction with the city or other groups to help move their neighborhoods forward. So it's really a kind of a look in the mirror of, okay, what do we really want to be 10 years down the road, and how do we get there? So it's allowing the neighborhood residents to take control of their neighborhoods. This was the neighborhood and community map, again, identifying some of those areas. This is fire station coverage areas, fire districts, service areas, neighborhood service boundaries, those types of things. One of the last chapters of the plan before the implementation chapter is economic development. We had a series of economic development goals. As I spoke earlier, you've already established some of these hubs for the employment areas, which are kind of the driving force behind the economic development. And you've got the two different areas north of downtown and the airport that allow you to attract a range of different types of and styles of employment, which is a positive. But really the economic development hinges on kind of the three-legged stool of economic development. It's not a earth-shattering idea or anything, but attention, retraction, and entrepreneurship, and really trying to balance all three of those things within your community so that the peaks may not be as high as some of the highs, but the bottom won't be as low as some of the lows either. So if you have that balanced kind of economic development strategy. The economic development hubs we talked a little bit about, the airport. Downtown will continue to be a major retail service hub, and how we transform that into more of a mixed-use center with residential, continuing to add the residential and those types of things. 9th Street corridor on the south of retail, South 9th, the Halstead I-70 interchange, again, that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for an economic development impact. So that is kind of the half-hour version of the overall plan. I'm sure there's a lot of things that I missed that you may have questions about, and I think, as Dean said, our hope tonight would be your consideration for adoption, and then moving on to the City Commission for final adoption at some point in the future. So with that, I'd take any questions or comments, concerns.
Questions of Graham? Like you say, most of us have been through this at least a few times, but the process has been really interesting, and it's nice that there was a lot of public input in this, and
Yeah.
I think that's what makes it a really viable plan.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This time, we would like to hear from the audience. This is a public hearing to solicit your comments on this plan, and if you would like to comment on it, please approach the podium and tell us your name and address.
Stan Byquist, 2601 South Ohio. I know you've listened to me before, and I'll keep this very brief. I have the piece of property on South Ohio in front of the old Knox sand pits, how it's commonly referred, on the east side. Still in the county at this point in time, but soon to be hopefully brought into the city. And as the map indicates now, it's classified as suburban residential, and I'd like to maybe see a little not so much an exception, but an expansion to urban residential, which gives a little more flexibility. I guess my grand view of the area is where you could have somewhat of a mixed use, because it is a main, Ohio now is 4-lane, it's a main street, a lot of traffic, where you could have some type of light commercial right on Ohio, and then you back off of that. Or you could have a mixed center. It could be residential on top, commercial on the bottom. But I think that area could be very prime for some type of mixed use. I mean, surely it's down the road a bit, but I think that it would be a waste of quite a nice investment in the street if it just was bordered with residential. And that's all I have, but, unless you have any questions.
Any questions of Stan?
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Stan. Anyone else?
Future land use.
Questions or comments?
Property right here, Filling in Ohio, and he has property right here, and the yellow indicates suburban residential.
So if we were to respond at this point to that concern, what form would that take?
Well, one of the options that we laid out for you, and we've already laid out some that related to the conservation area, I guess, for our perspective, this is a little bit like the letter of map amendment process on the floodplain. One of the things, if you felt that the suburban residential was too low of a development density for that Ohio corridor, and you felt like you were ready to adopt the plan tonight, you could say with an amendment or addendum relating to the property on the east side of Ohio, and basically that map there, rather than going in and physically changing the map, would be an addendum to say that that property should be depicted as urban residential in your view, not suburban residential.
So the plan that was brought to us by the Mazes is certainly already moving in that direction, and perhaps...
That is correct, except the difference is that the area there right at the intersection of Schilling is shown as a neighborhood center. Then as you grow north, it's showing as suburban residential also. And the difference being on Mr. Byquist's property, there's no indication of any options for anything other than low-density residential. And I think his other point is that it's very difficult to see, but this area here, this is reserved at Prairie Glen, and that is shown as urban residential. That's right to the directly to the north of Mr. Byquist's property, and that's shown urban residential because that really reflects what's there, which is higher density housing and an office building.
Yeah, I'd have to flip-flop on my view. I was originally kind of against extending that, but with seeing the Mazes plan and seeing that there, I think I would be, I'm encouraged to go ahead and allow that as well. I mean, I don't know if that was Sydney's view, but I think I could, and Stan brings up a good point. That's a heck of a nice street, just to have a few houses chucked up against it.
It seems in fitting with the tone of the whole comprehensive plan that gets used as a mixed-use area. It'd be hard for me to not visualize that as having some kind of commercial.
Right. Your contradiction with that would be, and Mr. Byquist also developed Eastview Estates there east of Ohio, where, you know, your alternative, if you say single family or low density only, is that you line, like you have on the south side of Magnolia, it's lined with homes that aren't going to face the street but basically back up to Ohio. So what Mr. Byquist is asking for is a designation that allows a little higher density on the arterial frontage.
Dean, this is one situation where the plan may need a little fine-tuning, but I'm sure as we move through this plan over the next years, or the city does, there will be other areas that surface that need to be reconsidered because they may not have been planned exactly right. How does that happen then? It's just somebody appeals to the commission to change the plan to meet their particular needs at that time, or tell me, I don't know.
Well, how that has worked in the past, and Mr. Byquist went through that on the other side on Quail Meadows. Quail Meadows originally was shown as 100% low-density residential. Mr. Byquist, which I think followed shortly after the Liberty addition there, said, again, look at Magnolia and Ohio it's a arterial intersection, and there's no commercial anywhere on either of any of those corners. If you're going to have the next neighborhood center or commercial node, it should probably be at Schilling and Ohio. So as part of that action, we reported that the plan showed it as low-density residential. The Planning Commission recommended that the plan be amended to allow for limited commercial there, then recommended that the zoning be changed. So anybody in the future who has a designation that doesn't support the proposed zoning or development, that's going to be called to your attention by us, and your options are to amend the plan because what's proposed is more logical, or to stick to the plan and say modify your plans to be consistent with the plan. You're always going to be faced with that decision. And in this case, Mr. Byquist is trying to be proactive by identifying that now. And we have said the Gould Evans presented a conceptual future land use plan. Staff had a weekend retreat where we went through parcel by parcel with a fine-tooth comb and identified areas and brought those to your attention. There actually, all the changes are listed in your staff report there, where there was somewhere between 40 and 50 things that we fine-tuned. This didn't happen to be one of them, but it's one that Mr. Byquist brought to our attention, and the plans that he's conceptually had there don't necessarily fit suburban residential very well. So he's just being proactive in that regard.
Graham, since we're paying you to be here tonight, somewhat unrelated to this, planning trends kind of come and go, and we've heard new terms this time around that we didn't hear last time around, you know, complete streets and things like that. What came before us a couple weeks ago with this very same area was a development, and the idea that I think a question that we had is, how many curb cuts do you make along major arterial streets? What are the trends at this point when you're confronted with that kind of development and have lots of cars whizzing by all day long? And
Well, I'm sure an engineer would tell you something different than I'm going to tell you. But, you know, the arterial street network is for the movement of cars. And every time you provide a break into that arterial street, you're, in most instances, you're going to impede the flow of the cars. I know a lot of places have gone on their arterial street networks that they have, you know, access management standards. KDOT's big on access management standards on their highways and on their state highways where they go through communities and things. And they're really, I think some of that's standardized. I guess what I would tell you is, on a case-by-case basis, you have to look at it. But from my 2 cents, or from my professional planning background, I would say you want to minimize the arterial street network breaks and provide that internal circulation within that development.
so you're not seeing anything different occurring with access roads and
No, now when you get into, I think when you get into more of an industrial setting, you start to see what they call reverse frontage roads or frontage roads, where you're providing, especially when you get into somewhat of a rural situation, you provide that access point to get off of the through, and you get on the access road. And I think that's, again, in an industrial kind of office park setting, that's a big trend. But again, it's I think to protect the integrity of that through traffic, that movement. So you're getting those cars off one time and getting them onto a system that's not on the arterial street network. And I think that's a big thing with kind of these mixed use centers. is that internal circulation. Once they're in there, how do they move within that, not only by the automobile, but obviously pedestrian and bicycle. The other thing is there's life safety issues with access for fire and police and all those things, which obviously are a minimum standard or a standard. But for the arterial street network, I think you're trying to limit those breaks. And I would say, if anything, the access management gets stricter on arterial streets as far as access to provide just that through traffic.
Just to clarify for us, Graham, in one of the implementation or development criteria items was that cross-access easement should be required. Isn't that the concept that you have basically a private frontage road or private set of driveways that tie lots together with one access point, as opposed to having an access point for each
Right.
individual lot?
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, Dean. And a perfect example would be South 9th, where you may have 4 pad sites in a row that are trying to face, and you've got a frontage road there. That's the frontage road concept. If you don't have the room for the frontage road and those buildings are up towards the street, you dedicate access at one point on that block, and then the adjacent property owners or that property owner is required to give access to the adjacent property owner, so it does act as a frontage street. It's typically a parking lot lane that you're using as that. And again, within a mixed-use center, if you think of, I always think of mixed-use centers as a big square or a big circle, and if you're moving throughout there, you may have multiple property owners within that mixed-use center. You have to be able to, the whole idea behind the center is you want some cohesive development there, so it doesn't look like just a bunch of stuff plopped in proximity to one another. So that cross-access becomes important as well, if it's not going to be a dedicated public street.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments from the audience of staff or the commission or from Graham from Gould Evans? Boy, we must have done a really good job on this comprehensive plan, Graham.
Just getting back to Stan's issue, if no one else is going to, just for my 2 cents, anybody who has any thoughts or plans of changing, now would be the time, because you're going to save us meeting time later on in life, that's for sure. We like short meetings, so if you have something you want to change, come up, don't be afraid. We're probably pretty open to the idea of it. But meanwhile, looking at Stan's issue, I don't remember the plan exactly, but it's pretty low density office stuff you were kind of talking about too, wasn't it? And again, now, Dean, I don't remember. I don't go down that side of Ohio that much. Is there a turn lane in there in the center? Is it 5? Or is it just 4?
It is all 4 lane. There's a turn lane at Schilling.
Schilling, okay.
But it's entirely just a 4-lane street with turn lanes at Magnolia and at Schilling.
Okay, yeah. I think even Mesa's development wasn't real high density, and we'd kind of talked about limiting some of the entrances in. I think we'd probably need to do that a little bit with Stan's, unless you see a frontage road to the back or something. Any concept of that yet? I know we're still real early. I know you had a bunch of things going on, but
Yeah, I've been working with Dean for, 5 years maybe on this, and my concept, I actually have a curb cut there now, which is the old Knox Sand Pit Road, which when they put Ohio, it's a wide curb cut. And I also have an agreement with the city to have one halfway through the property. And my vision is to use the one that divides the property in 2, running east and west, and that would be the main entrance in there. And then you go throughout the area there, and in developing on the Alsop site, one of the things I've worked with Dean on is a cross access between the Alsop site and my site, and if that were to happen, then I can actually do away with one of my Ohio Street entrances.
do you foresee your development having a bunch of curb cuts other than you just see those 2?
Just the 2, and possibly only 1.
Oh, well, I would definitely have no problem then with moving towards making
And I guess
the
the other thing I would in my vision, I I think this has to be similar to what we have going at Quail Meadow down on the corner of Schilling and Ohio, in that it is a planned area, so that whatever happens comes back to the commission for final approval to, approve the building or the business or the
Yeah,
traffic flow or whatever.
It'd be a planned development district, that's what you're...
Yes. And thank you, unless you have any other questions. Thank you.
Stan. Dean, are we capable of taking a formal action at this meeting?
If you feel you are, you are.
Do we ever feel that way?
What I will describe what we would do. I made reference here to a resolution, and what would occur is that if you look at page 3 of your report, and Planning Commission alternatives recommend the plan document supporting plan maps be adopted with certain revisions or modifications being made to the documents and or maps. We had identified some substantive changes that you had recommended on the conservation area, and let's say that there was majority support for modifying the designation of Mr. Byquist's property on South Ohio. Then what we would do is we would prepare if you voted to adopt the plan at this meeting, we would prepare a resolution for your signature, and that resolution would itemize the specific things that you had addressed at your different meetings as revolved to the conservation area, to Mr. Byquist's property, to your desire to make a priority the development of a trails master plan, those types of things. That would be put into a resolution, and then that's what would go to the City Commission as a record of your recommendation. So that we would use the resolution to itemize the things that would be minor revisions or modifications to the way the plan is drafted today.
Any commission?
But it is a matter of a simple motion to adopt or continue or whatever you think is the appropriate action.
Just a quick question. The difference between, I'm thinking about urban residential, which is what Stan had talked about, and then neighborhood center. What you've kind of denoted there at the intersection of Schilling and South Ohio is what?
As a neighborhood center.
And so the density of use between that idea and the urban residential is what?
It's not really so much the density as just the scale. The neighborhood center means that you're really looking at the intersection and all 4 quadrants of that, and you're looking at Quail Meadows, and you're looking at Liberty, and you're looking at all those quadrants and trying to look at all those at once, whereas the urban residential says we're looking at what the density ought to be, and that's not really an intersection or a node, so it kind of stands on its own.
So urban residential would be a better designation than at
The
this point at that area.
the difference, as I explained to Mr. Byquist and why he's inquiring, is that the suburban residential has the primary use is low-density housing. You could have duplexes, townhomes, or apartments as a secondary use, but it doesn't really contemplate larger uses or offices or support service businesses, things of that nature. The urban residential does, and that's the primary difference. And the urban residential is what you see at reserves at Prairie Glen.
And then on the map, you make the designation of how far in that goes. Do we need to stipulate how far along it goes, or?
It's basically going to go to the Knox Sand Pit. It's going to be that area between Ohio Street and the Sand Pit is the area that would be the urban residential. Because Mr. Byquist has a lot more property there, but most of it's underwater.
Dean, we discussed quite a bit at one of our meetings or two of our meetings about educational use areas.
Yes.
And that impacts our district because right now, according to this plan, that'll be considered a neighborhood center where we have, significant property. How does that fit into the picture when we get that all worked out where that can possibly become educational use? How do we change that area to educational use if it's called neighborhood center at this time? And that would, the specific area I'm talking about, but there could be other areas because we're talking about a lot of schools in the area that are in different parts of town, but certainly in Cloud and
I'll let Graham speak to that also, but I think the concept of neighborhood center includes things like institutional uses, churches, schools, things of that nature.
Yeah, I would agree with Dean. The idea behind the center, again, is to congregate those uses so that they're accessible, immediately adjacent or easily accessible to one another. So the land use designation, as you read it in here, would include some of those civic and institutional uses. So it would be allowed, as I would sit here and interpret it, it would be allowed within that.
And there is an intent also, and that's addressed in the plan, that there is a recommendation to create such a public use district, for things like fire stations, schools, things of that nature. So that's a natural follow-up there. But I was looking at it the same way as Graham, that the concept of a neighborhood center includes residential components, commercial components, and institutional components like schools, churches, those type of things.
thank you.
Any further discussion?
Wait.
I'm sorry.
Harold Morrison, 1605 North Ohio. And back last time on the conservation area, is that set in stone? If someone wanted to develop something just north of the dike, can it be done on Ohio Street with
John, if you
modifications?
Do you have that one separate map, John, the urban service area map that has all the things combined on it? Yeah, maybe if you could magnify that a little bit. The recommendation of the Planning Commission was to keep all that area that's shaded in yellow intact and keep that as a conservation area.
Yes.
And the areas within that are blue are floodway.
Yes.
And they are pretty much off limits already today, so that is not a change. What the Planning Commission suggested or recommended as a possible exemption to that is you've got property that's just directly north of the levee, correct?
Yeah, both sides of Ohio Street.
So you're talking, say, right here?
Mm-hmm. Where is the dike? Is that
This is
the
the
blue,
dike
that
here.
purple line? Yeah, yes, sir.
But you're right in here.
Both sides.
What the criteria that they suggested was, one, if you are an area that is served by public utilities, which that is not, or if you're an area that you can show by elevation that your property shouldn't be included in a flood designation, or then that would be grounds for an exemption or exception that would allow that to be developable. So in other words, there's a flood elevation calculated for that area, and if it turned out that
What is that?
I don't know what exactly is for that site. We can certainly find that for you. But
And I'm not talking about anything in the near future, but if my grandchildren or somebody wanted to develop it, that would not be totally blocked out if it can meet the criteria.
we discussed this, which is the Ward property.
Yes.
And this property here, which is yours. And if, I imagine the closer you are to the levee, the higher the elevation is. And if you show that the land, even though it's in the conservation area, is by elevation high enough to be out of a floodplain, that would be one of the criteria that would allow it to be developed.
Can the land be filled?
It means by natural area, because, and Graham can speak to that too, but one of the things of the conservation area is certainly to discourage filling, because that reduces the capacity to carry and store water.
I understand that, but Foley Tractor is raising their land. The truck dealer, they just raised the lot behind them before they poured it.
Right.
The Flying J was raised.
They
Harley Davidson was raised.
those areas, by law, you can fill floodplain areas or raise their elevation, not floodway areas. And
But if I'm in the flood plain, it can be raised.
it can be raised under the floodplain regulations, but what the plan is recommending is that
Is not
that
allowed.
that not be allowed, and that development be discouraged to keep the flood carrying capacity of that area
Then
open.
Why was Foley allowed to raise?
Because for the most part, Foley wasn't in the floodplain, and for the second part, this conservation area was not in effect at that time.
Well, I was just asking if there could be a modification in the far distant future. If
There could be something that the Planning Commission could entertain, but we try to create some safety valves in there without getting away from the concept. And certainly, I said again, Graham can speak to that, but I think that importing fill into the conservation area would kind of defeat the purpose of keeping that as a conservation area.
Whatever. Thank you.
And I was going to say, and Dean, that doesn't mean we're never going to allow it. I mean, if somebody came to us with I mean, I understand we're trying to steer away from that, but it's like everything else that we've done since I've been on the commission. That's the reason we're here, is to hear, if you come to us 6 months from now and say, hey, I've got this great idea that's coming through, we all sit down and butt our heads together, and Sydney gets her trees in front and I get whatever, we might go, that sounds like a real good idea. But I think what we're trying to do overall, I mean, is to discourage that, as you can understand, and we want to set up some standards to keep people from building in those areas. But that doesn't mean it's an impossible no. That doesn't mean when your grandkids come before our grandkids, I guess, that there won't be some, we're a pretty flexible board. That's why we're here.
We changed the language from will not to discourage.
Right.
And that we've done already with some criteria for some allowable exceptions. But, obviously the problem of flooding in Salina is one that affects many, many people. And if we build up one piece of land, then we obviously displace that water to someplace else and create more of a flooding problem someplace else. So, and Graham, I'd like to hear, you've dealt directly with this, I believe, in Kansas City. Is that correct?
Well, not directly in Kansas City. Well, I take that back. Doing some work along the Missouri River. The Corps of Engineers is very strict about floodway, but they also have a lot of communities they're starting to encourage to deal with their floodplain as well. We've done a study up in Nebraska for the city of Lincoln on a portion of a stream corridor, and they were trying to decide what their standard should be, and they looked at it as excuse me, what the development would result in a net rise in the flood. And so a lot of communities have adopted just a straight number of, you have to show that it won't raise the flood level more than a half a foot or 2 feet or whatever it is. And so we did a series of calculations and stuff for them, and they ultimately came back with a no net rise, which, as you can imagine, is pretty strict. Basically saying, if you fill this over here, it's got to go somewhere. Show me where it's going to go, and it's not going to go above where it's going now. So that is kind of a practice that's going on. I think what Dean started to talk about, and what we've talked about a little bit, is what this conservation district really does is change the city's policy on developing in those areas. And in the past, you've allowed people to raise those and displace the water And what this is saying, once this is adopted by the city commission, is that there's opportunities to allow that, but it's going to be really severely looked at. And it's not just, I've got a piece of property, I want to develop it, and I'm not suggesting that people are looking at it that way now, but so I should be able to develop it. You're going to have to show us in many ways that it's not going to create an adverse impact on somebody else before we allow you to do it.
Thank you.
And, I was also going to throw in, the other thing Dean started to talk about, and Mr. Kennedy started to talk about a little bit, is this is intended to be a living document. So it will be edited and it will be amended and changed over time because development practices will change, your policies will change, and those changes should be reflected in your plan so that you can continue to grow in the manner that you want to at the time that you want to. So amendments are normal. So just keep that in mind too.
Thank you. Any further commission discussion on this matter? I would entertain a motion.
Motion that we adopt the plan as presented with the addition of Mr. Byquist's request of urban residential with mixed use in that area, I think was to be included.
And the other items that we've talked about in the other meetings.
Right. Unless I hear differently, I would incorporate what you had discussed with the conservation area.
Mm-hmm. I'd second that.
And
Oh, sorry.
in
Sorry, Dean.
addition, to make sure that we're clear on the fact that neighborhood use includes our necessary uses for public education.
Right. And we can include that in the resolution as clarifying that neighborhood center includes commercial, residential, and institutional components.
Thank you.
I'll still second it. How about that?
We have a motion and a second to adopt the plan with the talked about items. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None being heard, motion carries. Thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity also to thank the staff, thank Gould Evans and Salina Downtown Inc., Phil Klima, for all of the work, and the citizens too, for all of the work that they put in this. This is a document that really took a lot of people's input, and the community had large input on this, and the disaggregation of all the data that was presented was unfathomable almost. But anyway, you guys did a great job and presented us with a lot of overwhelming information. But and this is what a partial binder of it looks like, people. But anyway, it's been a very interesting process, and I know that we've all learned a lot in this process. And thank you very much for your help.
We appreciate all your time and attention that you were willing to devote to that. And so what would happen is your recommendation would go to the City Commission. They would refer this plan to the Saline County Commission, and they can submit formal comments prior to City Commission adoption, because this plan does include areas that are outside the city limits, and there's a formal opportunity for Saline County to submit comments.
So the interlocal agreement issue is not one that we take up, at least
You
not-
will eventually.
Not at this time.
Not at this time. We had them linked, and now they're delinked.
Okay.
But it's a follow-up item, short order.
All right.
But we appreciate you coming to an evening meeting, and we'll have regular business for you on the 16th.
Thank you. We are adjourned.